Marcus was 41 years old when he realized he had been waiting. Not for anything in particular, just waiting. Waiting for things to settle. Waiting for the pain to dull enough to think straight. Waiting for something some morning that would feel different from all the others. He was sitting at his kitchen table at 4:58 in the morning. The apartment was small. The light above the stove was the only one on, and it made the rest of the room look like it was still asleep. His coffee had gone cold. He hadn't noticed. In his left hand, he held his father's watch. Leather strap, cracked at the buckle. The face frozen at 6:14, the time it stopped working. 3 years ago, the same week his father died, he wound it anyway. The way he did every morning, whether he meant to or not. A habit that had outlasted the reason for having it. Outside the window, the sky was still dark. That deep, heavy blue that comes before the light decides to arrive. He didn't know yet that this morning, this ordinary, quiet, unremarkable morning would be the one that changed the direction of everything. I want you to stay with this story. Because somewhere in what Marcus learned inside that first hour, there's something that belongs to you too. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something real. What time do you wake up, and what is the first thing you reach for? Not what you wish you reached for, what you actually do. In those first 30 seconds, before your brain decides what kind of day it's going to be, think about it. Because this story is about exactly that moment, and I think you'll understand why by the time we're done. Stay with me. Marcus had not always been a man sitting alone in a quiet apartment at 5 in the morning. 3 years earlier, he was a foreman. Construction. He knew concrete the way some people know music by feel, by sound, by the way it moved when conditions weren't right. He'd worked his way up from a laborer at 23 to running a crew of 14 by the time he was 36. And at 37, he did what ambitious men with a little success in their bones tend to do. He started his own business, a small outfit. Just him and a partner, a man named Gary, who had capital and a good handshake and a way of talking that made risk sound like opportunity. Marcus had the knowledge. Gary had the money. They shook hands on it over lunch one Tuesday, and Marcus drove home thinking maybe this is how it starts. It started fine, then it stopped. The details of how a business collapses are usually less dramatic than people expect. There's rarely a single explosion. It's more like a slow leak you keep telling yourself you'll patch tomorrow. Marcus and Gary disagreed about money, then about clients, then about everything. By the time Marcus understood the depth of what had gone wrong, the debts had names and the bank had opinions, and it was too late to fix it quietly. The business closed in the spring. The divorce came that fall. Not because of one fight, not even because of the business, but because two people who were already distant discovered that distance gets harder to cross when the thing you were both building collapses between you. His wife, Sandra, was not a villain in this story. Neither was he. They had just become two people who were very good at existing in the same house and very bad at finding each other inside it. Marcus moved into the apartment in November. He was 38. He had a truck, some tools, a box of his father's things he'd been meaning to sort through for 3 years, and a daughter named Lily who was 11 and who looked at him sometimes with an expression he couldn't fully read. He worked jobs where he could. Day labor, subcontracting, anything that didn't require him to be responsible for other people's money. He stopped setting alarms, not intentionally. It just happened. When there's nothing urgent to get up for, the alarm starts to feel like a lie, like it belongs to a version of yourself that no longer exists. And so, for nearly 3 years, Marcus drifted through mornings the way water drifts through a cracked pipe, slowly, without direction, losing a little more pressure every day. The night before the morning that changed things, Marcus sat across from Lily at a diner on Fletcher Street. She was 14 now. Taller than he remembered from 2 weeks ago, which felt impossible but also felt true. She had her mother's way of sitting straight-backed, composed, watching. They talked about school, about a friend of hers named Maya who had said something unkind, about a book she was reading for English class about a man who goes to sea. And then, somewhere between the French fries and the check, Lily looked at him. Not the polite look she used when she was being careful with him, the real one. The one that saw past the surface. She said quietly, without accusation, "Dad, are you okay?" And Marcus, who had been preparing for that question for 3 years without knowing it, said, "Getting there." She nodded, like she'd decided to believe him. He drove home at 9 in the evening and sat in the parking lot for longer than he needed to. He thought about what getting there actually meant, whether it was still true, whether it had ever been true, or whether he'd been saying it the way you say fine to a coworker as punctuation, not as information. He thought about what his father used to say. Not the famous things fathers say, the proverbs and the advice, just the ordinary things. How his father used to get up before sunrise every day, even weekends, even holidays, not to be productive, not to optimize. Just because, as he once put it, the morning belongs to the person who shows up for it. Marcus went inside. He set an alarm. 4:55 a.m. He hadn't done that in 3 years. He didn't know why he did it then. He told himself it was an experiment. Something to try. A small thing. But small things have a way of becoming the whole story. The alarm went off at 4:55. He reached for his phone out of pure reflex and then stopped. Put the phone back down, sat up, feet on the floor. Sat there for a moment in the dark, just existing, just breathing. The apartment was so quiet he could hear the refrigerator hum. He made coffee. He took it to the table. He sat with it. That was it. That was the whole activity. Sit, coffee, quiet. And what he noticed in those first few minutes, the thing that surprised him, was how much he had been missing this. Not the 5 a.m. specifically, but the owning of the moment. The sense that this hour, right here, belonged entirely to him. No one was asking anything of him. No one needed anything. The day hadn't started yet, and so it couldn't disappoint him yet. And this is the part most people miss. The first hour of your morning is not just empty time before work. It is the only hour in the entire day where you decide its character before the world weighs in. Every other hour after that, something will happen to you. A message, a problem, a person, an emotion that came from someone else's choices. But the first hour, if you protect it, is yours. All of it. Marcus had given that hour away for 3 years. He'd spent it half asleep, phone in hand, absorbing other people's urgencies before he'd even decided what his own were. That first morning, he took it back. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like sitting alone in a quiet apartment before the sun came up. But it was something. It was intentional. And intention, it turns out, compounds. By the end of the first week, he had a routine. Not a rigid one. Not one he'd read about in a book. Just a shape the morning naturally took when he stopped fighting it. 4:55 alarm. Feet on the floor. No snooze. First 10 minutes coffee. No phone. No news. No noise. Just the sound of the building and whatever was happening outside his window. He started to notice things he'd stopped seeing. The way the sky shifted colors in a sequence that was never quite the same twice. The particular quiet that exists in a city between 5 and 6 a.m. Before the deliveries, before the commute, before the voices. A quietness that felt almost respectful, like the world was giving you one last chance to hear yourself think. He called this his 0 hour. Not because nothing happened in it, but because nothing was demanded of him during it. The number was still 0. The debt was 0. The pressure was 0. Just him and the morning, and the coffee getting warm in both hands. Here is what I want you to understand about silence, because most people have forgotten what it actually does. We live in a world that fills every gap. Every commute, every meal, every pause, there is always something to consume, something to play, something to feel, and most of it is fine. But what gets lost, slowly, over years, is the ability to be still with your own thoughts long enough to find out what they actually are. Marcus had spent 3 years running from the quiet, because the quiet had opinions. It would remind him of what he'd lost. It would make him face the question of what came next. But he found sitting there in those early mornings that the quiet wasn't the enemy. It was the thing he needed most. Not to escape it, to sit inside it until it stopped being frightening and started being useful. This is a true lesson, and it matters. The quiet is where you hear yourself clearly, and you cannot build anything real until you know what you're actually building toward. On the 8th morning, something small happened that Marcus would remember for years. He was at the table. Coffee, the watch in his left hand, the way it always ended up there at some point in the morning. He was winding it the familiar rotation, 3 turns, 4 not thinking about it, and then he stopped. He looked at the watch, really looked at it. The cracked leather, the scratched crystal, the hands pointing to 6:14, a time that no longer meant anything except that it was the last moment the watch had worked. He thought about why he kept winding it. The honest answer was, he didn't know. It was a habit that had started somewhere around the funeral and had never left. It felt right. It felt faithful. Like showing up for something even when showing up didn't change the outcome. He set the watch down on the table. Then he picked it up and wound it again. Here is what I believe Marcus understood in that moment, even if he couldn't have said it yet in words. There are things we do that don't produce visible results. They don't move numbers. They don't advance goals. They just are. A small ritual, a consistent action, something that says, I am still the person who does this, even now, even in the middle of everything. And those things, the small, unwitnessed ones, are often the ones that hold you together when everything else is falling apart. Winding the watch didn't fix anything. But it reminded Marcus, every morning, that he was still someone who showed up. Still someone who did the thing even when the thing seemed pointless. You have something like that too. Some small act that quietly tells you who you are. Don't stop doing it. By week 3, Marcus made a rule. No phone for the first 45 minutes. Not a complicated rule, not a philosophy. A simple boundary between him and everything that wanted his attention before he'd had a chance to decide what deserved it. He'd noticed, once he started paying attention, that the mornings he checked his phone first were the mornings where the first hour felt like it belonged to someone else. A news story that made him angry before 6 a.m. A text from a past client that brought up the old business. An advertisement that reminded him he wasn't where he thought he'd be. None of it was catastrophic. It was just noise. Small weather moving through. But small weather, every morning, becomes a climate. I want you to think about this carefully. The moment you pick up your phone, your brain shifts from a state it was managing on its own to a state that is being managed for you. By algorithms. By whoever sent the last message. By whatever story decided to trend overnight. That's not a warning about technology. Technology isn't the enemy. But the order matters. Marcus discovered that when he waited, when he let his own thoughts arrive first, before the incoming tide of everyone else's, the thoughts that arrived were cleaner. More his own, more honest. He started keeping a small notebook. Not for journaling, not for productivity planning. Just for whatever came up in the quiet. A concern about Lily. A memory of how his father used to make decisions. An idea about a way to bring in extra income that he'd been dismissing without examining. The ideas hadn't changed. He just created the conditions for them to surface. It was on a Sunday morning, about 5 weeks into the new routine, when Marcus wrote something at the top of a blank page in the notebook. 3 words. Not too late. He didn't know exactly why he wrote it. It wasn't a revelation. It wasn't an answer to a question he'd asked. It was more like something his chest had been holding that finally asked to be written down. Not too late for what? He couldn't have said precisely. Not too late for another start. For Lily to see him as someone still building, rather than someone who had finished trying. For whatever version of himself still had things to prove, not to the world, but to the same man who used to get up before the sun because the morning belonged to people who showed up for it. He put the notebook down. Then he picked it up and wrote one more line. I am building something. I don't know all of it yet, but I'm going to keep going until I do. And this This is the part that I think matters most, more than any of the other lessons. Most people who are starting over, really starting over, after real loss, they don't let themselves name what they're building. Because naming it makes it real. And real things can fail. And they've already failed once. And they know how that feels. So they stay in the vague. They say getting there. They keep the goal just out of focus so it can't hurt them if it doesn't arrive. But Marcus had learned, in that apartment, in those early mornings, that vague goals produce vague effort, and vague effort produces nothing. You don't have to know the whole picture. You just have to name the direction. Write it down, even 3 words. Even if they feel small. The dawn doesn't care how quiet your ambition is. It just needs to know you're awake. 42 days after the first morning, Marcus almost stopped. It didn't happen dramatically. Nothing in his life happened dramatically anymore. The real things moved slowly, like weather systems, like debt. It was a Tuesday. He had finished a subcontract job the week before, and the next one hadn't come through. Money was thin. His landlord had called twice. He'd spoken to Lily on the phone Sunday, and she'd seemed distracted, which she was allowed to be, being 14. But he'd hung up, feeling like the distance between them was wider than geography. He woke up at 4:55 the way he'd been doing for 6 weeks. Got up, made the coffee, sat at the table, and thought, what is any of this for? Stay with me here. Because this moment, this particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from one bad day but from 40 days of good effort that doesn't seem to be producing visible results, this is the moment where most people stop. Not because they're weak, because they're tired. And because the gap between what you're doing and what you can see from it is the loneliest stretch of the whole journey. Marcus sat at the table. He picked up the watch. He wound it. He put it down. He looked at the notebook. He read the 3 words. Not too late. He didn't feel them. He understood them intellectually, the way you understand that the sun exists even when you can't see it. He opened the notebook to a new page and wrote the date. Then he wrote, hard morning. Still here. 2 words. 3 if you count the date. He closed the notebook. He sat with the coffee until it was gone. He did not quit. Not because the morning was inspiring. Not because something changed. But because at some point in the past 6 weeks, the act of showing up had stopped requiring a reason. He showed up the way he wound the watch. Not because it fixed anything, because it was who he was deciding to be. 3 months after the first morning, Marcus took a call from an old contact, a project manager named Tom who'd seen his name passed around as someone reliable, someone who understood the work from the ground up. They needed a site supervisor, not glamorous, not his own business, but steady, well-paying, and the word Tom used was trusted. Marcus took the job. Let me be careful here, because this is the part of the story where it's easy to draw the wrong line. The job was not a reward for waking up early. The mornings did not produce the opportunity the way a formula produces an answer. What the mornings produced was a man who was ready to say yes to it. Ready meaning clear-headed enough to evaluate it fairly. Steady enough not to dismiss it out of pride or accept it out of desperation. Present enough to show up to the interview and sit in that room as someone building something, not someone surviving. That man had been built in the quiet hours, one morning at a time, over 45 days that no one had witnessed and no one had applauded. This is the thing about the first hour that most people never discover. It doesn't change what happens to you. The world keeps moving at its own pace. The opportunities arrive when they arrive. What changes is who you are when they arrive. A man who has spent 45 mornings owning his first hour carries himself differently. He has had a daily practice of meeting himself honestly, in silence, before anything else weighs in. He has built a small, invisible structure inside himself made of consistency and quiet intention, that the world can't see but that shapes everything he does. Marcus didn't know this consciously. He just knew that when Tom called, he didn't hesitate for the wrong reasons. 6 months after the first morning, Marcus was having dinner with Lily on a Sunday. The same diner on Fletcher Street. The same booth even. Lily ordered the same thing which she'd been doing since she was 9, and which somehow still surprised him. She looked at him across the table. Not the careful look. The real one. She said, "You seem different, Dad." He asked how. She thought about it. "Like you're here," she said. "Like you're actually in the room." He nodded. He didn't say, "I've been getting up at 4:55 every morning for 6 months." He just said, "I'm working on it." She nodded. Like she could tell that was finally, actually, true. Let me bring you back to the beginning for a moment. Marcus was 41. Quiet apartment, cold coffee, a watch that didn't work, that he wound every morning anyway. He wasn't looking for a morning routine. He wasn't trying to optimize his life. He was just a man who was tired of waiting and decided on one ordinary night to try one ordinary thing. Here is what he learned, and here is what I want you to take from it. The first thing: own your first moment, before the phone, before the news, before anyone needs anything from you. That moment, even 10 minutes of it, belongs to you. Take it. The second thing: guard the quiet. The quiet is not emptiness. It's the only place where you can hear yourself clearly enough to know what you actually think. The third thing: do the small thing. The unwitnessed act, done consistently, is what holds you together when everything else is uncertain. The fourth thing: protect your first thoughts. Let yourself arrive before you let the world in. The order matters more than most people know. The fifth thing: name what you're building. Even 3 words. Even if you can't see the whole shape yet, vague intentions produce vague results. Name the direction. None of these are complicated. All of them are hard to do consistently, day after day, in the dark, when no one is watching, and nothing seems to be changing yet. But that invisible, consistent, quiet effort is the thing that changes everything. Marcus still lives in the same apartment. It's a little less quiet now. There's a small table by the window where he keeps the notebook, and a few more things on the walls than there used to be. He still wakes up at 4:55. He still winds the watch. The watch still doesn't work. He's thought about getting it repaired. He probably will, eventually. But not yet. Because there's something about the act of winding it, the knowing it's broken, the winding it anyway, that still says something to him every morning. Something he doesn't want to lose. I don't know what morning you're watching this in. I don't know what year it's been for you, or how long you've been waiting for something to shift, but I know this: the dawn doesn't wait for anyone. And it doesn't ask whether you're ready. It comes anyway. And every morning it comes, it brings with it one thing, 1 hour, that belongs entirely to you, if you decide to take it. Marcus took it on a November morning, when he had every reason not to. That's the whole story. What will you do with yours? The dawn doesn't wait for anyone, but it always comes. If this story found you at the right moment, stay with us. There is more of Marcus's journey coming. And I promise you, it gets harder before it gets better, but it gets better. Think about your morning. Think about that first thing you reach for. I'll see you at dawn.